Hello, this is Jerry Morton. Welcome to my Finding My Way podcast. This is podcast number 36, titled Testing. Podcasts 34 through 61 are stories from the year of Army training I experienced. The training started in August 1966 and ended in June 1967. The stories are published in the book Reluctant Lieutenant, From Basic to OCS in the 60s, which was published by Texas A&M University Press as a military history. Testing is an account of the various tests Jerry experienced before entering the Army and during the first days of basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey in August 1966. It is recommended that you listen to the Army training stories in the order in which they are presented, so that you can appreciate the full contextual richness of the later stories. Testing. Up! Formation in 30 minutes! Sergeant Zarconi announced as the lights flickered on and off several times. We moved fast. Even though it was just the second morning, the beginning of a pattern was forming. Shave, brush your teeth, get dressed, make your bunk, set the wall locker straight, square away the foot locker, and tie down the laundry bag at the end of the bunk. Everything was done the Army way. After a mad dash down the stairwell, through the slamming glass doors to stand at your spot, the rest of your 12-man squad forms surround you, as do the other squad members in the 4-squad platoon. All 4 platoons form up quickly, and the company is ready to go on its 2-mile jog before breakfast. Well, almost ready. There were always stragglers. Right beside them were the sergeants. All around both was noise punctuated by coughing. 1 or 2 guys would be singled out for special attention. The sergeants would converge on them for some unknown reason, unknown except for the black guy with the funny beard. They were always on him for not shaving close enough. This morning was no different. He stood at attention and shouted in his crisp British-sounding accent, "You're ignorant, my good man." "You calling me stupid?" one of the non-coms screamed. "No, you are ignorant," he repeated in a loud, crisp voice. "Then you are calling me stupid," the sergeant shouted as he danced around the target of his wrath like a barracuda moving in for the kill. "You do not understand the facts," the black guy loudly replied. He was jerked out of formation. The whole company was ordered to make a left face. The black guy was left behind. In my opinion, he had good initiative, but seemed to suffer in the area of judgment. I soon learned that the Army had an apt phrase for that condition. Good initiative, just poor judgment. We stepped off in quick time and were quickly ordered to double time, which meant more of the airborne shuffle. Arms straight down at the sides, leading foot about 1.5 inches off the ground, and a half-pace stride that made the shuffle easy to do for a city block or 2. After that, you begin to breathe hard. A half-mile into it, the stragglers had begun to make their move. Stragglers made a 2-mile run more difficult than it ought to be. They are spread throughout the formation. At first they start to slow down. If one of them is in front of you, you have to slow down, which makes the guy behind you slow down. It takes great skill to avoid stepping on the heels of the guy in front of you. Most people lack such skill. The sergeants seemed to sense where the stragglers would appear. One always materialized to urge them on in an unfatherly manner. When a sergeant's words failed to motivate a straggler, the sergeant would turn on those around the guy and demand that they pull, push, drag, or do whatever else was necessary to keep the guy in formation. Even this assistance was not enough for some stragglers, who would gradually fall behind the company. Such behavior seemed to be intolerable to the sergeants. They would pull a panting trooper from the formation and make him stay with the straggler to urge the poor fellow on. This meant that the two of them would be late to wherever they were going. In the case of the morning trot, it meant they would be last in line for breakfast. Being last in line meant that you probably would not have time to eat all of your food before the company formed up again outside to begin the day's activities. Stragglers were not a happy group, nor were those who had to deal with them. Breakfast was good, lots of good food. Unfortunately, few of us had much of an appetite after a 2-mile run. This was not good. We had been warned that there would be no snacking. We were not allowed to have candy bars or to receive care packages full of goodies from home. They said it brought out cockroaches. The Army did not allow you many options for making personal choices. You only ate when the Army told you to eat, which was 3 times a day, unless a straggler, extra duty, or a screaming sergeant delayed you beyond the point of no return. After chow, they marched us to the dental clinic. Long lines greeted us. You quickly got used to standing in line waiting for something to happen. It is a great opportunity to get caught up on the rumors. In the Army, no one officially tells you anything. Rumors keep you informed. Someone told me that with a master's degree in psychology, I was eligible for a direct commission as a first lieutenant in the Medical Services Corps. That was news to me. Why had my recruiter not told me that? Someone else said there were guys in their 3rd week of basic training who still had not been issued combat boots. They were doing all of their marching in civilian shoes. God, I thought, that had to hurt. The Army seemed to be short of everything, or just have too many men. Several were willing to volunteer to leave the Army just to help out. I was surprised at the large number of men who said they had been told to return to the dentist to have teeth removed. Some had teeth pulled on the spot. Others were given appointments for extractions that afternoon or the next day. Guys were bragging about how many teeth they had pulled. 5 was the largest number I heard that day. They must have had a lot of Novocaine, for they were all smiles and laughs as they reported their totals. Next came the eye doctor. The optometrist I saw told me I really did not need glasses, but they could clear up the fuzziness I experienced when I was reading. I was unaware that I was having trouble reading. He asked me if I wanted a pair. What the heck, I thought. They are free. I accepted his offer. More marching, and no one ever tells you where you are going or what you are going to do when you get there. Another line out in the sun. This line is taking a long time to get where we are supposed to do something. The people in charge at the end of this line are particularly nasty. They are shouting. People near the front are often ordered to drop and knock out 10, 20, sometimes 50 push-ups at a time. Some guys were on their back with their arms and legs scratching at the air. The dying cockroach position became extremely painful to maintain for all but the shortest time. The closer I got to the table with 2 sergeants sitting at it, the more intense the harassment got. I tried my best not to eyeball the non-sergeant soldiers assisting the sergeants at the table. Eyeballing happens when you look to the left or right when you are supposed to be looking straight ahead at nothing. The assistants bore no rank on their arms. They probably were privates or new arrivals like us. It had already become clear that the Army liked to give temporary status to people who did not know what they were doing, so they could tell others what to do. I think they thought it was good training. The guy in front of me was ordered to knock out 20 push-ups. Because they were caught talking, 2 guys behind me were ordered to assume the dying cockroach position. No one spoke to me. I worked hard to keep myself under control. I did exactly what I was told when I was told. There was no eyeballing on my part. As a result, I had no peripheral knowledge as to what would happen when I reached the end of the line. The sergeant's voice came as a surprise to me. I knew that I would be the next up. My compliant behavior had kept me from gleaning enough information to understand what was about to happen. I had no idea what I would be asked to do when I reached the head of the line. When the man who had been in front of me finished whatever he had been doing at the table with the 2 sergeants behind it, one of them motioned for me to step forward. I quickly complied. "Look inside this and tell me exactly what you see." The sergeant grumbled as he pointed to a binocular-like device sitting on the table. He pointed at my left hand, in which I held a card I had been given to fill out earlier, and said, "Give me the card." I handed it to him, and then leaned over the machine on the table and rested my eyes over the 2 eyepieces. I had no idea what I would see. Whatever it was, I had better tell him exactly what I saw, or it was clear I would be in a world of hurt. "I see a dog on the left side and a ball on the right, Sergeant," I stated as honestly as I could, raising my head from the instrument. "Don't get smart with me. I'll send you to the end of the line, and you can try it again if you want to be an asshole. Asshole!" He snarled. I was stunned. I had done exactly as he had asked. What had I done wrong? "Look again, and this time you better not be a smart aleck about it, dipshit," he said. Both the speaker and the other sergeant leaned forward as if they were about to spring out of their chairs and hit me. I was undone. It made no sense. Again I looked in the 2 eyepieces. "Oh," I said in surprise, "the dog is jumping over the ball." "Okay, get out of here," came the response. Up to that point, I had not known that fear could significantly interfere with the way we see 3-dimensionally. I had thought the mind's ability to put the separate images it receives from the eyes into 3-dimensional picture was an automatic brain function. I had always believed that only seriously brain-damaged people were deprived of this ability. It had never occurred to me that it could be triggered by emotions. I must have missed that in the college textbooks on psychology of perception. Maybe researchers had not yet discovered that fact. I was to learn a lot from the Army about how fear and stress affected human behavior, my behavior. After lunch, they marched us a long way. The sun was hot. Soon we were all dripping with sweat. I was tired, as was everyone else. When we finally got where we were going, they put us into a large open room with little school desks in it. This was the paper and pencil testing area. As testing goes, many of the items were interesting. Having just finished 2 years of studying about testing people with the Stanford-Binet IQ test and the like, this was educational to me. There were few written instructions, but a lot of diagrams. Many of the subtests made clear what they wanted to know about what we knew. For example, one test required us to match pictures of certain hand and power tools with pieces of equipment to be repaired. Anyone who had worked on cars would have done well on this one. I had never worked on cars. Instead, I had to use logical deductions. That was hard work. It was made even harder because we were tired, stinking with sweat, and thirsty. Test after test after test was given. They even gave us a test that was pretty much like a typical driver's license test. The last test was the OCS qualification test. That's what it said on the cover. Like the one I had taken in early July, it had a lot of questions I could not answer. That was 2 months ago. I had to use logic to make educated guesses. The questions were not derived from my everyday life experiences. The muzzle velocity of a bullet fired from a .30-30 rifle was something I had not learned in college or graduate school. School psychologists did not study such stuff. However, I did know the speed of light and the speed of sound. The bullet could not be traveling at the speed of light, but it was traveling faster than the speed of sound. That was a start to figuring out the most probable answer from the choices presented. The exam was pretty much like that, except for the railroad schedule questions. I had taken the OCS exam in July in a completely different environment. My Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania draft board had classified me 1A in early June. Until that time, I had thought I was immune to the draft. I was under the impression that being married, in graduate school at Miami University of Ohio, and having a year to go on a school psychologist internship in the Cincinnati area school system exempted me from military service. I had thought wrong. When I called the draft board in Pittsburgh and explained that I would not finish my master's program until the first week of August, and that I then had a 1-year internship to do, I thought they would change my status. The best they could do, the voice on the other end of the line stated, was put me at the end of the list of eligible men to be drafted in June, July, and August. Then, on September 1, I would be the first one on the draft list. This did not mean that I would not be drafted before then. If the Army told them they needed to call up everyone on the June, July, or August list, then I would be called up, she said. That was the best they could do, she repeated. My wife and I had briefly considered leaving the country. My thinking was that I had enjoyed the benefits of being a U.S. citizen without many demands being made upon me. Now I was being asked to fulfill an obligation of citizenship. The fact that others might not have to serve in the military was not a big issue. My country had called upon me to pay my dues. It was all right with me if I never paid them. But that was not my choice now. Having consumed many privileges, including a public education, government loans for higher education, police protection, good roads, and so forth, my obligation to repay the country when asked to do so was clear. That was how we reasoned it out for ourselves. We had not followed news of the escalation in Vietnam very closely. I spent all of my time studying in graduate school, and Anna spent her time teaching high school English or preparing her lessons in the evening for the next day. There was just no time for national affairs. We both knew I could get killed in Vietnam. During those deliberations, I remembered a dream I had had. It was when the Cuban Missile Crisis was at its peak. The campus Navy Reserve Officer Training Corps building was located behind my college dorm. Late at night, I could faintly hear the sounds of dots and dashes emanating from its large radio tower. I figured it was Morse code and often would fall asleep with that sound in my ears. I was aware of its presence. Part of me wondered if I was being foolish by not signing up for NROTC in order to get my military obligation out of the way. At the time, I thought there was a serious possibility America might get involved in a full-scale Third World War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was hot news. Anyway, I had this dream in which I was pinned down behind a rock that was slightly bigger than my head. An enemy machine gun was zeroed in on my rock. Bullets were hitting it in a steady stream. I dared not move. Several other soldiers were in the same position as I was, with one exception. I could see a lieutenant stand up, fully protected by a huge boulder. He was a classmate of mine. Unlike me, he was enrolled in the NROTC program on campus. Unfortunately, I had always considered him to be both obnoxious and out to lunch. Over the chatter of the machine gun bullets pinging on my rock, making it smaller and smaller, the lieutenant yelled at us, "On the count of 3, you will get up and charge!" As he slowly counted, I thought, "Like hell I will, you stupid fool. You'll get me killed instantly without even exposing yourself." For the first time in my life, I was faced with the reality that I would not be a hero. All of my adolescent life, I had read about heroes. Horatio Hornblower, Ivanhoe, Robin Hood, John Wayne in the movie She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, and scads of others who did brave things against impossible odds while being morally impeccable. These were my idols. I wanted to be just like them. I loved westerns. Shane, starring Alan Ladd, was a real favorite. Randolph Scott cowboy movies had been a staple for me as a kid. The heroes always stood up and did what needed to be done. In my dream, I realized that war could kill you. Stupid people could get you killed. I was not going to do something that would get me killed just because a stupid, silly, uncaring authority figure told me to do it when I knew it was wrong. When I awoke from the dream, it was with several stark realizations. If I had to be in the military, I needed to obtain as much authority over myself as I could. They were not about to change just because they took some ROTC course or the like. Most important, I realized that I was not going to be a storybook hero. Those stories do not match up to reality. I knew I did not want to be in the Army. I would have to do whatever it took to get into the Coast Guard or the Navy. My father was a career Coast Guardsman. My grandfather was a career Coast Guardsman. and my mother had been raised on Coast Guard stations. Family tradition had it that only stupid people went into the Army. My experience at the Cincinnati Armed Forces Entrance and Examination Station in May had confirmed that mindset. When we were all herded together to take the Army exam, it was clear from the questions that some of the prospective draftees asked that several of them could not read. Yes, sir, stupid people went into the Army. Stupid people got themselves and others killed in the Army. In between exams and paper assignments at Miami University of Ohio, I contacted the Coast Guard and Navy recruiter. I wanted to take their OCS exams. You cannot just walk in and take their exams, however. Appointments have to be made because they only give the test at specific times. The Coast Guard exam was first. I knew it would be heavy in math, which was my weakest academic area. I could never remember formulas for things like the volume of a cylinder. My algebra was also very rusty. Since that stuff was difficult for me, I would have to get the right books and study. I had a heavy schedule at the university, so you can guess what happened. I never did get around to studying. A couple of weeks after taking the Coast Guard OCS exam, I went back to the recruiting office to learn how I had done. They had both good and bad news. The good news was that I had passed the exam. The bad news was that all of the Coast Guard OCS classes were filled until January. I thus would not enter the Coast Guard until January 1967. That was 4 months too late. Come September 1, I would be a private in the Army, marching off to war. My scores on the Navy exam was below the cutoff for their OCS program. Again, math was my low area. This time, 2 of us entered the recruiting office to get the word on our scores. The other guy was in the clinical psychology master's program at Miami. Fate had brought us together at the same interview time. We had been in a couple of classes together. He had another semester to go before graduation. I could not remember his name, but we struck up a friendly conversation as we waited for the recruiter. The recruiter was seated at his desk talking to someone on the phone. Our conversation was pleasant. There was a degree of controversy at the university over the clinical and school psychology master's program. The 2 groups of students had very little interaction. In the course of our conversation, the clinical psych guy told me that a lot of his peers really admired my answers in the projective testing class. Whenever we were asked to speculate about the underlying meaning of a client's response to a thematic apperception test card or other projective test item, my responses were always on the mark. He said they were in awe of my ability to understand the client from such little information. I was both stunned and flattered by his praise. I had had no previous feedback from the instructor or from the students concerning my responses in the classroom. That was why I had stopped making any input in the class as of late. Addressing my classmate, the recruiter congratulated him on passing the test. He told him he had made good scores across the board. I was embarrassed to learn that my scores were just below the cutoff point. Having my classmate there, particularly after he had just told me how much other graduate students valued my in-class responses, was tough. The recruiter must have been listening in our conversation while he held the phone to his ear. After giving me the bad news, he told me to wait a minute. He dialed a number, waited a moment, and then said, "Yes, sir, about the other one. I know his score's a little low, but I think he has other qualities that make him a good candidate." After a brief pause, he said, "Aye, aye, sir," and hung up. Looking directly at me, he smiled and said, "You're both in. You'll be in the January OCS class." Good news and bad news, all at the same time. It was bleak news that I had to give my wife that night. Here it was early July, and I could not get into either the Navy or the Coast Guard in time to avoid being drafted into the Army. I would have had to spend 4 years in either service, but that was better than 2 years as a grunt in the Army. People got killed in the Army. The stupid people in the Army got people killed that did not have to be killed. This was not good. I would have to go to the Army recruiting office as soon as possible. Maybe I could get some special training or something that would help me stay alive. I was going into the Army, that was for sure. How was I going to make the best out of this bad situation was the only unanswered question left. I explained my situation to the recruiting sergeant. He was most understanding. The first thing I needed to do, he explained, was to take the Army's OCS exam. That was fine with me. I was ready to set up an appointment with him to do just that. He smiled and said no appointment was necessary. I could take it right then if I wanted. Wait just a minute, I thought. I need to study and prepare for the exam. Remember, I do poorly in math. Just wait a minute. This is the Army. Its OC exam cannot be that hard. They have the lowest IQ average of all the services. People must pass their tests who cannot read, I reasoned, remembering the questions at the induction center. The sergeant escorted me to a little room. It had a small table and a chair in it. He explained that the test would be timed. He would give it to me and return when the time was up. I would have to stop the moment he re-entered the room. The examination began. It was much like the one I was taking in basic training. If I had been raised in a hunting and farming community with lots of hands-on experience with practical problems, I think I would have clearly known the answers to many of the questions. As it was, I had to rely on logical deduction to figure out the answers. Things were humming along fine until I hit the section about the railroad schedule. God almighty, it was complicated. There was a big section full of train schedules from one city to another at different times to many different locations. Under it was a long series of questions like, if you left Detroit at 8 a.m., what would be the earliest you could arrive in Seattle? Well, if there were a direct train from Detroit to Seattle, the answer would be fairly simple. However, instead of going straight to Seattle, it looked as if you would have to make at least 3 transfers, maybe more. As I studied the complex schedule, my first impulse was just to skip those questions and go on to the rest of the exam. They were just too hard to work out. No, I reasoned. Remember, this is the Army. They make tests stupid people can pass. I knew I was not stupid, so surely I could figure it out. By the time I completed that series of questions, I was certain I had correctly answered all but one of them. time, however, had to be getting short. I could always go back to it at the end if there was any time left. Now it was a race to get through the easier questions. I had no idea how much time was left, but I knew I had to rush. I had spent a lot of time on the railroad questions. Just as I completed the last question, the sergeant entered the room and said, "Stop!" It was a relief to be done. The railroad questions were really hard. When should I come back to find out how I did?" I asked the sergeant. "We're going to score it right now," he said cordially. "You just wait here. It'll only take a few minutes." He took the exam book and my answer sheet and left. I overheard two people talking in the hallway outside my door. They entered the room in front of mine and continued their conversation. The wall was thin, and I recognized one of the voices as that of the recruiting sergeant. "He's doing pretty well," the sergeant said, his voice muted by the wall. There was a brief period of silence. "My God, he's figured out the railroad schedule," the second speaker explained. "No one's ever done that. He must have cheated." No, sir, Captain," replied the sergeant. "I watched through the window as he took it. He didn't bring anything into the room. He just sat down and did it." "Well, that's the best score I've ever seen," the captain stated. "It might be the highest score anyone's ever gotten. I'll go check up front, sir." There was the sound of a chair sliding on the floor. Then a door opened, and I heard the sound of footsteps traveling down the hall. A few minutes later, the sergeant was back. "We only have records for our region, sir. He clearly has the highest scores anyone who took the test here ever had." "Sign him up," said the captain. Doors opened and closed. I felt pretty good. Yeah, I felt damn good. "You really did well on this test," the sergeant said, his face beaming as he entered the room. "Let's go into my office and talk." He told me that because my test score was high, I could enroll in any OCS program I wanted. I explained that with my MS degree in school psychology, my training could best be used in a position in which I helped soldiers determine their aptitudes for different career paths in the Army. "Oh, that's the Adjutant General's Corps," he explained. "There isn't an OCS for that. You'll have to get a branch transfer from some other branch in the Army that has an OCS." "Well, what branch is the easiest to get a branch transfer out of?" I replied. "More people transfer out of the infantry than any other branch," he responded. "With your high scores, you'll do very well in infantry. The top 10% of infantry OCS class get a branch transfer upon graduation if they want it. You should have no problem being in that category. That's when you can transfer over to the Adjutant General Corps." "Oh," I said, completely confident that things would work out fine. We agreed that I would start in early August, 6 days after I finished the last of my courses at Miami of Ohio. As I remember it, the sergeant said that I would have to go through 8 weeks of basic training before going to OCS. I would take basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and then go to Fort Benning, Georgia for infantry OCS. It would last 6 months, after which I would have just 2 years to serve. This was working out better than I had ever hoped. The Army would put me in a working situation that related to my education, and I would only be in the Army for 2 years and 8 weeks. The other services would have had me doing things unrelated to my training for 4 years. I was pleased with my good fortune. What had seemed a bad situation was turning out well. When I got home that evening, my wife and I celebrated the nice turn of events and began planning what we would do. There was not much time for me. Being a full-time graduate student was consuming most of my waking moments. I could not afford to do poorly in my courses. If you got more than 2 C grades in the master's program, they dropped you from graduate school, regardless of your grade point average. Anna wanted to move closer to her relatives in Kentucky while I was at Fort Dix in Benning because she would not be allowed to live with me during my training. That meant she would have to find a teaching job in Kentucky. We would have to find a place for her to live, and then we would have to move. That left us with a lot to do from early July to the end of the first week in August. We managed to do it all while coping with life's little unexpected ventures, like blowing a rod through the engine block of the car just before final exam week. It was a relief to get on the plane in Cincinnati. I was really tired. All of these thoughts were in my mind as I stared at the railroad schedule in the OCS exam. It could not be identical to the OCS test I had taken in Cincinnati. It had to be a different form. I scanned the schedule and read the first few questions. I thought it required too much concentration. It was too hard. I was too tired. It was the end of the day. I just could not concentrate. I took a few educated guesses, but I just could not bring myself to weave through all those possible train transfers to be certain that my answers were right. Besides, what difference did it make? I was already accepted for infantry OCS. 2 days later, we got our test results. They provided a surprisingly detailed computerized analysis of our scores. My overall score placed me in the 93rd percentile. The quiet guy in the bunk next to mine was in the 99th percentile. I had received a passing score on the OCS exam. It was a lot lower than my first score. I wished I had concentrated on the railroad schedule. Obviously, there were people in the Army a lot smarter than me. I was embarrassed at my ignorance. The quiet guy was from a farm family. He did not want to go to OCS. I thought that was a mistake. He said his family needed him to come back home as quickly as possible so he could help make ends meet. Extra time spent in special training programs meant more time away from the farm for him. On the day we got our test scores, about 20 other guys and I were called out of the company formation. We had been selected for the hands-on portion of the truck driving test. If you passed the test, you would be assigned as a truck driver for details. The word was that being a truck driver was the best detail assignment you could get. Almost all of the others were hard, boring tasks. On detail assignments, you were the janitors of the base, the hard laborers on construction jobs, and the grunges in the kitchen cleanup process. Truck drivers just drove trucks. They did not load them. They did not unload them. They were never assigned to any duty but driving the truck. Nice work if you could get it. They took us to the driving test area in a truck. It did not make sense to me. I could not remember anything on any of the Army tests that suggested I was truck driver material. Oh yeah, there had been the driving exam, but it was simply rules of the road stuff. Everyone in the company should have passed that. I had never driven a truck in my life. I had no experience with a manual transmission. The car we used in high school driver's education was an automatic. My parents had always had cars with automatic transmissions. In my entire life, I had never even tried to shift gears in a car with a stick shift. I just did not know how to do it. "You're next," said a salt and pepper-haired sergeant, his clipboard in his left hand and his assistant at his side. "There's no point in having me get in the truck, Sergeant," I said sadly. "I have never driven a stick shift before. I don't know how to do it." He looked at me with a kindly smile and said, "You passed the written portion of the exam. You know more than you think." "I'll wreck the truck," I said, trying not to be disrespectful. "I really have no idea what to do. Besides, passing a written exam has nothing to do with knowing how to shift gears." "Son, the Army says you'll take this test, so I guess you will." He spoke in a consoling manner, much like a father talking to his own son. "Besides," he said with a beaming smile, "it isn't all that hard to learn. I'll teach you." "Okay, Sergeant," I shrugged with a smile and sad resignation. The sergeant, his assistant, and I climbed into the cab. Clipboard in hand, the sergeant sat next to me with his assistant riding shotgun. I was in the driver's seat. The 2.5-ton truck, soldiers called them deuce-and-a-halfs, was big and had a cab that was high off the ground. First he showed me where first, second, and third and reverse gears were. Then he had me practice pushing in the clutch and putting the floor to steering wheel high gear shift through the series of gears. You started out in first, and once it got going, shifted into second. Then when the engine seemed to be straining, you went to third. He told me to always push in the clutch when starting the engine or changing gears. It was also important to come to a complete stop before trying to put it in reverse. If there was any forward motion, you could strip a gear. Finally, after moving the gear shift, he told me to slowly let the clutch out and engage the gear. "You got all that?" he asked after about 5 minutes. "No," I said, laughing. I can't remember all that." "Not to worry. Start her up and I'll tell you what to do as we go," he said with a little more seriousness. I reached for the dash panel and moved the ignition toggle switch to the on position. The sergeant nodded, and I depressed the gas pedal slightly and stepped on the starter button. The truck lurched forward. My foot automatically hit the brake, forcing the truck to momentarily stop. Since I had failed to step on the clutch, the truck continued to jump violently forward in short rabbit hops. It took only a second or two, but we had jumped several yards before I remembered and stomped down on the clutch pedal. Pushing himself away from the dashboard and reaching for his clipboard on the floor, the sergeant patiently said, "Remember to push in the clutch before you start it." With a sheepish grin, I nodded. This time I pushed in the clutch before turning the toggle switch on. It started just fine and began to roll. Another truck was pulling out from the parking area and was about to pass in front of me. I took my foot off the clutch and put on the brake. The truck stopped instantly, and the engine stalled. Once again, my two passengers pushed themselves away from the dashboard and picked up their clipboards. "You want to push in the clutch as you put on the brake so it won't stall out," the saintly man said quietly. "That means using your left foot on the brake instead of your right." This time I got it started and moving in first. I made a right turn to get out of the parking area. As I approached the stop sign at the motor pool gate, I remembered to push in the clutch before taking my foot off of the gas. Before I got my right foot off the gas, the engine roared into racetrack form. Quickly, I remembered to ease off on the gas. Unfortunately, I pulled back more on my clutch foot pedal than on my gas foot. The truck shot through the intersection. My quick reaction time and turning the steering wheel no doubt saved us from hitting the stop sign on the other side of the road. It did not keep the truck from stalling. Appearing a little more wide-eyed than when I had first met him, the sergeant dryly commented, "Let's give reverse a try." The truck was predisposed to jerk. No matter how hard I tried to prevent it, the thing jerked and stalled, jerked and stalled. I was pleased that I got it into third gear twice. The grinding of the gears whenever I shifted was so profound that every head in the testing area instinctively turned my way. All three of us were perspiring. The sergeant said he would park the truck for me. He agreed that I needed a little more practice before I could qualify as a driver. A lot of people watched me get down from the cab. It was embarrassing. I had blown my chance to get an easy detail assignment. When I told the story to the guys at supper, their laughter helped.